Hi, this is Ram from CrossMind Studio. Welcome back to another chapter from Mantaflow series, and today we are going to talk about explosions. So I have this default cube. Let's make it point 3 or something and move it down. So by default, when you create a simple smoke and fire simulation, let's make this one smoke and fire. So this is the motion you get. This simple motion that you get is basically coming from the buoyancy density and buoyancy heat. So if I make both of these 0, then there isn't anything which is driving our smoke and fire simulation. Technically, in the explosion, whatever the reaction happens, so multiple particles shooting in different directions. So all those particles also carry some velocity around them, and that is what pushes the smoke in different direction, and that combined with the buoyancy density and buoyancy heat helps you create a mushroom shape that you see typically in the explosion. So if I add some motion into this object that we have, so let's say if I go back to frame 0, first let's just disable the use flow, add a key and use flow on the second frame, and disable this again on the third frame, so that we have a simulation just for one frame, just like explosion, and bring back the buoyancy density and heat to 1. So technically this is an explosion, just that we don't have any motion or exciting shape going on over here. So let's enable our auto key and go back to frame 0, move it out of the domain. On the frame number 10, let's move it in and add some random rotation and location to it. Now if I enable the initial velocity on this object and make sure there is some amount in the source, now this will use the velocity which is being generated by this object. Let's say if we make a quick preview, now let's increase this into 5. Now this object's motion is actually carrying this smoke into direction. Let's just enable our sub steps so that much more samples are being fed into the simulation. Yeah. So now you can see whatever motion our object have, it's moving slightly towards the right and it's rotating. So I'll just add some more motion into this so that it's much more evident. So the rotation and the motion that is affecting our smoke. Let's enable the bottom collision. Alright, there you go. You have slightly interesting motion going on rather than just the smoke and fire rising up. I'll just save this file and make a duplicate of this scene. Now even though we're using a source velocity, at this point you can see the shape is quite basic. That's because our source object is quite basic. So the much more information you have in the source object, that is going to affect our simulation. So let's say if I enable the normal velocity and change this to 5, there isn't much difference it's going to make because the shape is still a default cube, as you can see over here. So if I go to the edit mode and subdivide this a few times and maybe add one displace modifier with a texture which is going to be distorted noise, and push this over here, so now we have some random shape and the normals are going to be much more distorted. If we use this now, you'll see the shape of the explosion. Even at the early frames, it looks quite detailed. It's not that we are just settling in over here, we're just getting started, so don't worry about it too much. But as you can see, the more information we have in the source, the much more exciting the shape gets. So let's scale this up a bit more. Let's use 20 normal velocity and see what happens. Now we have much more like distorted and expanding smoke and explosion basically. Let's add some higher number into the source. So basically you get the idea. So all these numbers will help you shape your explosion and you can just play with the different numbers in the velocity and the normals, and keep on adding stuff to it. You can enable the vorticity. I'm just trying to create a better example for you guys, so don't worry, this is not the explosion we are going to make for the final assignment. From this point onwards, you can also, let's say if I add one empty object over here, circle. So this circle, basically I'm using to parent our emitter to this one. Now if you ask me why, that's because this is an animated object, and if I copy this with the parent object, it's not going to reset the position. So now let's offset the keyframes of these objects, and maybe add more resolution around this domain so that it doesn't clips off from the edges. Now this way I think you'll get something exciting. So first we have this emitter, and then the other emitter explodes, and yeah, so basically you have something which looks like an explosion, and it's not just the flames rising up. So you get the point. And now if I just enable the dissolve, let's say for frame 25, and let's decrease the threshold of the adaptive domain, because otherwise at the later frames it's going to clip off our simulation. There's a lot I'm discussing over here, and if you have directly arrived on this chapter randomly, you have stumbled upon it, then please go back and watch the previous chapters. And because I just can't baby step and talk about each of the parameters over here, because we have discussed all of that in previous chapters, so I'm just going to fast track this one. Enable the noise and make a quick bake for maybe 70 frames. Let's bake all. So I have few frames over here, and as you can see, this does look like a very basic explosion. I mean, this is not the finest shape that you would want to settle on, but even then, I mean, we are just discussing the basics. So this is how you can chain and make a detail out your explosion with the basic objects. But even then, the shape looks quite not as chaotic. It's just a very simple explosion. In the real explosion, you have much more chaos, things shooting in different directions. So all that is much more easy to achieve if you're dealing with the particles. So now we are going to do the same thing, but with the particles. Now we are going to just delete everything and make the same thing with the particles. So let's just bevel this shape, add some subdivisions so that we get a good sphere, and maybe add some randomization. So we have this very basic emitter, which I would want to be around 0.4. So same thing again, quick effect, quick smoke, but this time we are going to use some particles. Viewport display, let's turn these down to 0.01, and we want these particles to emit for just 3 frames and maybe lifetime of 5. We just want these particles to give us, let's just disable the domain for now. So we want these particles to give us just a burst, like initial burst. I mean, if any of you have used Houdini, if you're dealing with the explosions and all that, I mean, you get all those different kind of explosions right from the shelves, and you have these pyro burst, pyro smoke, and blowy smoke, and all that presets. So it's quite easy to set up. But in the Mantaflow, I'm not sure what their plan is in the future, but you'll have to quite literally feed everything into this, and there are no presets or anything. So we have these particles. Let's make these particles into 50,000 and disable the gravity, force field weight, because we don't want these particles to fall down. Lifetime randomization, velocity into Z, we want these particles to move up, something like this. We have these particles, and now what we can do is add some force field, maybe turbulence over here, and assign some range around this, maybe till over here, and then maybe make another one which is going to be a wind. Give this one 5, give this one 5, maybe add few different forces over here, add different direction of the wind here and there. So now the particles will have different motion. I mean, let's make these alive for 10 frames. Yeah, so we'll have to increase the strength. So we'll talk about a different method of how to add more chaotic forces into your simulation with the particles in a moment. So So we have these particles and we have few force fields which are giving it some random motion. So let's add some more turbulence, and this way we can alright, so I'll just decrease the lifetime to 7, bake our cache. So we have these particles, and now let me just make a new collection for the forces so that we can disable these now. We just want those forces for the particle, not for the smoke. So now let's quickly add, or we already have a domain, and into the emitter, in the flow source, if you drop it down from here, you can see the particle system, and sorry, and in this particle system we have particle settings which are being like this particle we need to feed over here, and let's leave everything to default and see what's going on. Smoke, fire plus smoke. So let's do a quick preview. Yeah, so as you can see, just with a very basic setup, we get much more chaotic looking explosion. Over here, I think you'll be able to see much better preview. Do I have a light in here? So I don't think I have light. So let's add a light, point light, because without the light, I don't think you will get any shading in the viewport. So let's bring some vorticity and decrease our buoyancy so that it doesn't rise up so fast. So that's a good start, and enable the bottom collision so that some smoke sticks to the ground. Maybe change the resolution, adaptive domain. Yeah, this looks good. Like we were trying to make an explosion earlier, and we had to make so many things for that. Now with just a few particles, we are able to achieve a much better result, and there is much more chaos and the motion to this. Keep in mind, at this moment we are not using any initial velocity, so the particles, they just burst, they just create some nice shapes, and they just vanish. That's about it. And if you enable the initial velocity, then in the direction where particles are moving, like here and here, then that way the explosion is going to expand much further. So let's say if I give the source 20, like, let's put some dramatic number. So now we have much more, the explosion is expanding in multiple directions. So let's add this and make this into 50, and I'll just make the particle size 2.2. So yeah, I think this is looking good. Now if I enable the dissolve, make it frame 25, enable the noise, and decrease the strength, is resumable all, and bake it for around 70 frames. Alright, so we have the cache over here. I mean, not the finest result, but I think we'll have to play with the noise values a bit, and there is too much velocity going on. So maybe decrease the initial velocity to 10, and I think we can decrease it further to 5. Let's move this up a bit and bake this again. So yeah, this is what it looks like, and I think not getting into the details, but this does look like an explosion. I mean, from this point on, I can just play around with the shape of the particle. I mean, with the velocity of the particle, like in which all direction I want these particles to shoot. Do quite interesting stuff with this. Now let's say if I make a duplicate of this, and now in the fire, let's free this bake. If we make the flames to remain in the simulation for slightly longer, now the particles, I think instead of shooting up, let's decrease the z velocity which was moving up to 1. Yeah, now it's moving outside, and let's increase the number of particles to 100,000. Maybe in the physics Brownian motion, I mean, just add some randomness. If we animate our emitter from here to here, then we will be able to use this velocity yeah, that's quite stupid. 0.1, add some into point like y velocity. Basically I'm trying to randomize all this stuff, and let's just bake our simulation, I mean the particles. Now if we increase the resolution and bake everything, so here this simulation is on the 128 and the results look slightly more like granular, and but from this point onward I think you'll have to tweak your simulation a bit, because at early frames I think the particles look too small. So yeah, if we change our initial velocity to 10 and bring back the buoyancy density to 1 and rebake this again. So here I have the bake. It took me around 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes, 2 minutes I think. So it's a very small bake, I think just the 35 frames. So don't get excited about the bake times. So yeah, I kind of like it. It's not a complete explosion that I mean this is not the final result, but we are just getting started with the particles. So now everything kind of looks better than previous example where we were dealing with the geometry emitters. And now over here I think the particles are too small, so we can keep on tweaking those values. But the main concern over here is at the starting of an explosion. Now let's talk about the explosion, the motion of it. I mean overall this does look like an explosion. If I just make a 1 temp particles, if I just make a quick preview out of this, the initial shape of the explosion is quite boring. I think like if you just observe for first 5 or even the 10 frames, I mean it takes quite some time for our explosion to get into some good shape. Now earlier we had used these forces to add some variation in these particles, but there is other way we are going to discuss, and that will help you quickly add like a quick burst. Like for the initial frames, like you have much more chaotic burst, and it quickly expands, it have much more like a dynamic motion. So we are going to do that with the forces which are within the particles. So let's talk about that for a moment now. Over here I have quite similar setup. So if I go to the let me just delete the bake of particles. So if I play the animation, I have quite similar setup on the default settings. You can see everything is set to default, and we have 50,000 particles shooting up. So if I bake this, I'll get the results which will be quite similar to the previous examples in the explosion as we were discussing. So for initial burst and to create some much more chaotic shapes, like something like this, we need to add some forces, and instead of adding some force fields here and there and trying to randomize the simulation, I think the much more effective way is using the force field settings within the particles. So I'm in the particle properties and I'll enable the self effect and enable the magnetic force field over here. So by self effect, this means the force fields are going to affect the particle simulation as well. So let's say if I change this number to 10, then let's play the particle. Okay, we don't have any strength over here. Let's make this one into 5. Okay, so we have some chaos going on over here, and now this kind of simulation will give you a much more better results and the shape for your explosion. It's less linear, much more chaotic, and you have velocity in multiple directions. So this magnetic force field I find quite useful to quickly achieve these results. So let me just make it 15, and now this will make it way too chaotic. So let's assign some max distance, maybe 0.1. So yeah, this looks fine. Let's add some noise into it. So I guess this looks good. So I'll just make a bake for these particles before proceeding with the smoke simulation. And in this smoke simulation, this is set to 64. I'll just make a bake, and the noise is enabled. So everything is set to default pretty much. I'll just do a quick bake. Alright, so this is actually faster than I expected. So this is real time, you can see over here. I mean, the preview is real time, not the simulation. So now if I play the simulation, you can see at the early frames we have so much better the shape of the explosion. I hope you guys can bear the background noise. There are dogs outside, and I can never find a perfect time to record, so just bear with this. Now this explosion is quite good. I mean, I find it quite decent. I think if we set the resolution to much higher, I mean, keeping in mind this is only like a 2 minutes bake. This is quite low resolution, but I think one can use it for a distant explosion scene. Let me just enable the render. So I have the materials assigned to it. We'll discuss the materials later. For a low resolution explosion, the results are quite good. I think once we spend some more time into resolution and tweaking the settings, you can achieve better results with this. So what I'll do is let's increase the resolution and see what happens. So I'll just make it 128 and do a bake again and come back. Alright, so the bake is done, and this took me some time. I think around half an hour or something. So let's just isolate this one, and if I play this simulation, let me just scrub the timeline ahead. I think we have quite good motion going on over here. The shape looks quite interesting. I mean, even for the later frames, yeah, I think this looks good. I'll just make a quick render preview with this one and come back with the results, and I just want to see how this looks in the render. I'll give you a material breakdown later. So yeah, here I have the render, and this was done with the very few samples, and there is a lot of noise going on, but you can see, I think slowly we are starting to get some better results. And from this point onwards, I mean, you have a good base setup, and technically, like, when you have one good explosion, you can create any number of different variations out of this. So if you select the emitter now, let me just free the bake. So if I select the emitter now, and in the particles, let's say, okay, for the quick experiments, I'm just going to decrease the resolution to 64. So if I select particles and change the seed to, let's say, 40, and bake the particles again, and bake the simulation again, maybe add some variation into the velocity, or not, let's leave it to as it is and just play with the seed, bake all, and see what's going on. So I'm not going to fast forward this video so you guys can see the speed of the cache. I think it's quite decent for low resolution, depending on the configuration of your system. So for a low resolution like 64, I think it takes around 2 to 5 minutes. If you're dealing with a final bake, I think all the explosion took around 4 to 5 hours, whatever you've seen in the trailer. So I'll just skip ahead. Alright, so we have around 80 frames, and just with a different seed in the particles, you can see we have a different explosion. Now it's much more heavier on this side, because technically we have changed the particle simulation, so that's why the smoke and the explosion is going to change according to that. Now from this point onward, you can also play with the different settings of the buoyancy. So let's say if I decrease the buoyancy in the density and leave the heat to 1, and maybe change the source velocity to 10, then I'll get different results. So I have very few frames, and now you can see our simulation is not rising up as fast as previous example. That's because we disabled the density buoyancy. Now our simulation is only rising up where the heat is present. So over here you can see from this point onward, our simulation slows down, and only wherever the heat was present, it was rising up. In the later frames, it's going to be much slower. So this way we have third explosion, and maybe if I change the overall force field settings now, let's say we had 10 effector amounts, now if we make 15, then we'll get different result. Now let's play with higher buoyancy density. So now we have more buoyancy going on in the density. It's going to be much faster rising explosion. It's going to expand much more because we increase the number in the particle force fields. All right, so basically the whole point is, once you have one base setup and once you have nice burst, once you have created nice burst with a magnetic or any force field that you prefer, as long as you get the result right. So after that point, it's quite easy to create variations. You can play around with different settings, and there are n number of possibilities. And I'll just leave these files on the gumroad if you guys want to revisit these examples. Now overall, I'm quite happy with these results. Now obviously these are low resolution. We would have to spend some more resources on it to make it look like a cinematic grade explosion. Let's increase the number of particles and the number of the overall quality of the simulation. So let's take another example. So over here I have the same setup, just like the previous file. We have same emitter, same domain. Now let's create another explosion from scratch, and this time we are going to just push the limit slightly further and add much more detail into this. So instead of 50,000 particles, we are going to deal with 500,000 particles. So that's a good number. And size, visual input display 0.01. So yeah, these particles are falling down. So let's add one collision plane over here. As you can see, I have a collision plane. Let's select the emitter, go to the particle settings. So in the basic settings, we are going to emit these particles for just one frame and set the lifetime to 5. Maybe add more strength in the normal direction for the velocity, and some more z velocity so that the particles shoot up. And then we are going to do the same thing that we did earlier. Use the magnetic force field. Let's add 15 over here in the effector amount, and let's add magnetic. Change the strength to 15. Actually, let's make it 16. All right, and add some noise into this. Just choose any random seed, and that actually doesn't matter. Don't forget to set the max distance, otherwise it's going to get really chaotic. So let's bake our particles. So now that we have a quite significant numbers, I think 500,000 particles, it's going to take few seconds. So we have this particle simulation, which is good. And the only thing I would like to do is set the viewport display to 0.001. This looks good. I forgot to add lifetime randomness, so everything kind of looks uniform. So I think we can increase the lifetime randomness and bake again. All right, so I think we have quite a good burst for our simulation, and we are good to go ahead and bake the simulation and see what's going on. So on the domain, I have quite the default settings. On the only thing I would like to do is enable the bottom collision so that the smoke sticks to the ground like this and creates a mushroom. Otherwise it's just going to rise up, it's just going to create a cloud. So keep in mind, I'm using quite low numbers in buoyancy, like 0.1. By default these numbers are set to 1 and 1. So I want this simulation to rise really slow, so that's why I'm using 0.1 and 0.4 in the heat and density buoyancy. So you're free to choose any number depending on the kind of simulation you're going for. And then I want the presence of the smoke to stay for some time. I mean, I don't want just the I don't want the burst to the flames to just burst and disappear. I want those flames to stay there for a few seconds and then disappear. So that's why from this default number I decrease this to 0.3. So it's a quite basic setup. And so let's select the particles in the flow source, and the particle size is set to 0.1 and initial velocity is set to 5. All right, so let's do a quick bake on 64 resolution and see what's going on. All right, so it took me around 2 minutes, so this is quite fast. I think for such low resolution explosion it shouldn't take much longer. So as you can see, since we are using such low numbers into density buoyancy and density heat, our simulation is rising much slower. So this is like a large, if you're trying to make a large scale explosion, then you would want this explosion to rise much slower, because otherwise it won't give you that effect of the scale. So, and also the presence of the flames, you can see the flames stay there for quite few frames. That's because of the reaction speed we decreased over here. And at this moment, I don't think you will be able to see the effect of using 500,000 particles. That's because this is quite a low resolution. Now, the only thing I would want to do about this, like at early frames, we can on frame 2, I can set the size to much higher number, around 10, and set a key for the particle size. And around frame 6 or 7, we can make it 0.1 and set a key again. Now what this will do is, so we have these linear and straight trails going on, and once we bake this into high resolution, these will look bad. These will look like a sticks. All right, so instead what we want is, we want these particles to emit and then like narrow down. So at early frames we have bigger particles, and at the later frames we have smaller particles. So we'll get those conical, I think something like that we'll get. So you can animate this value, and you can actually use these values to create trails as well. We'll talk about this in a moment. I'm just going to go ahead and bump the resolution up a bit, like by 128, and let's see what's going on over here. All right, so we have this bake, and I think this is looking quite good, and I'm very happy with the initial burst shape, and overall I think it's well balanced. And keeping in mind this is only 128 resolution, so we are definitely going to bake it on much higher, like 330 or 400. So I like the motion. Let's just do a preview. Let's just do a preview and see the. All right, so let's play a preview. And as you can see, for the initial frames, instead of seeing few bubbles or like a solid geometry shape, we have very good reaction going on. This is because of the burst particle that we have made. That's what is going to eventually define the shape. And keep in mind, we are not using any force fields, or there is no motion in the emitter, nothing fancy going on. It's just a very basic burst. And I actually don't prefer using force fields with the explosions. That's because the velocity within the explosion is much higher than for any force around it to influence it. So I think whatever the kind of explosion you're dealing with, all the effort you need to put is in the emission, the flow source. The more detailed the initial burst is, and that is going to make your simulation look good. Other than that, force field and all that is going to overcomplicate the things. So I leave it to as it is, and bake this one on much higher resolution, like 330, and come back with the results, and maybe then we can render that out, and then talk about secondary things like particle trails and other things. All right guys, so I think we have the final bake, and this is on 330. Let me just play the preview because the viewport is quite heavy and I don't want to just scrub the timeline. I quite like the results. I think it's going to look pretty good in the render, and the viewport preview of the volumes in the Blender is not quite great, and as you can see, it doesn't give you a great sense of depth, and everything kind of looks flat. So if I render this out, let me just bring a preview, and we'll get into the material part later. So I'll just play the rendered part over here so that you guys can see the results. So this is the render from this bake, and it's exactly the same thing, same cache, and I have pre-rendered it for the preview purpose. All right, so as you can see, there is a lot more detail going on once you render it, and in the viewport you kind of don't get the exact sense of it. So sometimes it's better to do a quick preview, like just 1 frame or 2 frame, to see what's going on in the render. So if I enable the render over here, you can see it looks much better in the render. Or let's skip to the frame number 75. So yeah, I think this is going to work for our purpose, and I'll just leave it as it is. Let me just reduce the samples for the viewport. 16 is enough. I'm going to settle down over here for this explosion, and this explosion is exactly the same, and I used it for both the scenes if you've seen in the trailer. So the fire explosion, this one, and the explosion on the mountains. So these both are same explosions but with the different shaders. So once you have your explosion, you can just play around with a lot of things like different attributes, and like what we discussed in the second chapter, you can kind of tweak your explosions visual a lot on the shading level. So if you see over here, we don't have any flames in the viewport. Our flames have disappeared. This is just smoke. So to keep the explosion lit up with the flames, I'm using the density in the emission over here. It's a bit of cheating, but it works. I don't think there is anything wrong about density attribute in the emission. So now what we're going to do is we are going to talk about a few secondary things, like how we can make trails within the explosion, and how we can use the velocity which is generated by an explosion to use secondary effects like the smoke, the ground dust, and all that stuff. All right, so I'm just going to bring a different file over here. Alright, so here I have another file, and it's a quite similar setup. If I select the main burst source, I have 50,000 particles with only 5 lifetime, and I'm using the magnetic over here in the force field. So it's exactly the same thing what we have been doing just to create the initial burst. So I'll just bake this one on 28 for a quick preview. Alright, so here's the preview, and if I play this, you can see it's a slightly different kind of blast. That's because I'm not using any heat buoyancy, and there is only one buoyancy in the density. So I don't want this blast to rise up much. I want this to be more like a round explosion. All right, so a lot of dust and trails. So now we have the basic explosion. Now what you can do is you can also use a secondary particle system, which is let's say if I add one more particle system over here, and I hope you guys can bear the background noise. So by now you must be used to it. So this particle system only have 500 frames, and if I frame start, frame end, 1, and I'm using a slightly longer lifetime so that it doesn't end up with the main burst particle and goes slightly further. And also it has much more velocity, the particles I'm talking about, the much more velocity in the normal and z direction up. All right, so you know the basics of particles anyways. So in the physics properties in the fluid, I'm using a much higher sampling substeps because these particles are moving at very high rate. If I make a preview with the particles, let me just enable everything and make a preview. If I play this now with the particles enabled, you can see those secondary particles that we have created over here. You can use these kind of trails in your explosion to add a second layer of detail. All right, so this particle system is not very detailed, and the current particle system, as you know, there is not much you can do with it. So if you are trying to make something like a pyro burst or some like what you see in the Houdini, so I don't think I'm not quite sure. Okay, you let me know if you can create anything like a pyro burst kind of particles with the current particle system. So in the future, when we have particle nodes and all that, I think we will be able to make explosions and the presets much more effectively. So now keep in mind, currently we are using a very low resolution, like only 128. And one very important thing to keep in mind, so on the frame 0 or wherever whenever, like whatever the timings are for your explosion, when the explosion starts, I'm using max density and the size to 2. Now in the later frames, after the burst stops, over there I decreased the size of the particle to 0.1. This is the minimum size you can go for, and the density to 1. And you can see over here I have keys set up over here. Now as I was explaining earlier, like if you don't do this, then so basically particles are going to create one straight tube, like a cylinder kind of shape, and that's not going to look good for trails. So you can animate these values, like at the start of your explosion you can have bigger particles, and as they travel further, those can vanish with a like minimum scale and density. You can just bring these values down, and those particles will have much sharper um, shapes at the end of like just before they are about to vanish. All right, so this way you can create like a burst. So over here you can see this looks much better than just having a simple shape of the explosion. So I mean there are all kind of explosions, so it's there's nothing right or wrong. So I'm sure if you spend much more time on this, you can come up with even better solutions. So this is one of the thing. And now if I go to the, okay, I'm not going to get into the high resolution preview at this moment. We'll do that after we discuss the next thing. So if I select a domain and go to the smoke domain properties over here, we enable the viewport display, vector display. So as we were discussing earlier, so the explosion, like anything which is moving inside the domain, creates velocity. Now what happens is, okay, this is not quite any useful. So what happens is, once we have the explosion with the buoyancy and all that, okay, once we have the initial burst, then the explosion rises up. So we will have this cloud rising up, and it will make like a tree kind of thing. Now the motion, the vorticity, so basically just like how the shock wave happens in the real life. So at the start of the explosion, everything is kind of sent apart. So it's like moves out. So depending on the particles movement, and once the burst is there, then after that, when because of the heat and density, when this thing rises up, and this motion basically pulls everything towards it. So it's like the vorticity, the whatever is there, I mean if there is any smoke over here on the ground, it's going to reverse pull it with it, and much higher it rises, then you will be able to see that mushroom thing. All right, so let me just hide this one. So if I bring one ground smoke, I have this plane over here, which is very simple cube. Okay, so we have this cube, and this cube is just okay, just a moment. So over here, if I enable this cube, this cube have a simple geometry flow behavior, or you can make it inflow and animate the inflow just for 1 frames, just so that it leaves some dust on the ground. You can even use a few particles, so that's not an issue. So over here we have this geometry volume, and at this moment, without the preview of this geometry, you can see there is only one burst, then we have trails, the secondary particles, and that's it. Now once I enable this, just free the bake and do one more cache. Alright, so here I have a very low resolution preview, and I'll see if I can explain it over here. So at the starting of explosion, this ground smoke is quite flat. Okay, so at this moment I'm taking only I'm keeping it only box, and this is not a right way to achieve some great results. Maybe you can use some particles which emit without any Newtonian properties. So just to give you an idea like what you can do with it, so any velocity which is generated by the explosion is also going to affect the smoke, and like over here you can see the ripples, and once you bake this into higher resolution, and this looks much more pretty in the later frames. When this pulls it back, you will be able to see everything actually pulling back together. So like I said, the viewport visualizations are not really great in the Blender for the volumes, and it's really hard to see the things, and you can't actually move the light around and preview the things from different angles. So that's really something which I think can be improved. So I'll do one thing. I'll make a high resolution preview and show it to you like what's going on over here. Alright, so I'll just make this one free bake and bake it around 256 and see. I'll show you the results. All right, so I baked the another preview on 256, and here's the preview which you can see. And if you observe closely, like in the initial frames, the ground smoke is quite flat. And this ground smoke is just an example, guys. It's not actually a visually exciting thing. I think the right way to go about this is having some particles and instead of flat smoke that visually doesn't look good. But this is just to give you an example. And you can see till around frame 22 we have flat ground smoke, and once the velocity from these particles affect the ground smoke, then some ripples start emerging. And when the initial burst is over and the smoke is rising up, there is a this reverse force, and this will be much more visible. Let me bring up another preview which is already baked and on the 400 resolution. So this preview is the final one which I used for the trailer, where you have seen the ground smoke. So as we discussed earlier, in the starting frames there is no effect on the ground, and these particles, they leave a trail behind, and the velocity also affects the ground, and you can see the effect over here. And whatever force is emitted from this explosion, the velocity, that is creating these ripples. These results look much better in the high resolution. And in the later frames, when the explosion is rising up, we have this reverse pull going on over here. If you can see over here, like just try to observe this area and this area. So it's going inwards, like whatever smoke is emitted around, it's getting pulled towards the like because of the density buoyancy and heat buoyancy. And if I play the trailer again, so these shots, like this explosion is the same explosion. So I'll just mute the sound. So you can see it's exactly the same file, same explosion. I'll provide the file for the gumroad. So these shots, these are close-up shots from the same simulation. So if you zoom in a bit in the 3D file, you will be able to see all of this happening in this file. So let me just show you a render preview. So I'll stop talking. Once I enable the render, the audio is kind of going to get messy. So here's one of the camera. So it's the same explosion, and there are multiple views which you have seen in the trailer, and I'll give you a material breakdown later. It's quite basic and there's nothing to discuss about the material over here. But for the camera, I have multiple cameras over here. There is camera on the left side. Like I said, in the viewport, it might not look much, but the viewport preview is really bad for some reason. And but if you look closely and if you take out some render previews, I think you will be able to find something which is much more useful. Things look better in the render. So I hope this improves in the future. And yeah, kind of it bugs me a little. Anyways, so there we have one view, and all right, so I hope you get the point. And the velocity which is affecting the explosion can actually help you create some good ground dust. So flat plane is one of the way. And if I disable the ground smoke over here, so let me just see if we have this cube ground smoke. I'll just disable this and I'll free the bake, free data, and bring the resolution down to 64, or yeah, so something lighter. So instead of a flat ground, you can also use another particle setup. Let's say if there were a few particles and without any gravity. So basically, after the explosion happens, we just want few particles to appear here and there, and these particles can have smoke. And once the smoke is emitted, that will get carried backwards with the buoyancy when the explosion rises up. In the field weight, let's disable the gravity, and reduce the lifetime to maybe just 3 frames, and the particles can emit right after the explosion, the first burst is done. So maybe you can also use a torus and like something circular. So I'll just give you a quick example. All right, and then you can just bake the particles, go to the fluid properties, make it flow, inflow, particle, and it can have some initial velocity. Now let's see if we can get something good out of this. I'll bake the data. So smoke is emitted over here, like I can see some few patches, but maybe we can increase the size of the particles to around 2 and do a complete bake. Yeah, here's the preview, and as you can see, this particle plane which we roughly placed over here. So we see some smoke emitted by these. When the smoke starts rising up, the explosion starts rising up, all of this is all of that velocity is affecting this as well. So over here you can see it's going inside like this. I don't know why my annotation is not working. Yeah, there it is. Hey, yeah, so something like this. All right, so that's about it for the main explosion parts, and I hope you get the idea. It's a bit complicated things, and keeping in mind like we have so much limitation, like the viewport visibility and all that. It's kind of tough to work around this at this stage, but once you understand this, it's quite easy for explosions and any kind of basic simulation. There we have it. So at the early frames, these are like straight shooting up, and then later you can see the effect of the velocity adding up. All right, yeah, in the top view it's much more clear. So now let's talk about the materials which I've used and the scene breakdown which you've seen in the trailer, and then we are going to conclude this chapter. All right, so I'll take this first scene that we made, the final simulation with the burst particle. So we'll shade this one first and then talk about the rest. So this one, and pardon the voice in the background. I've disabled the RTX voice because it's kind of start cracking up the voice when you're dealing with the renders. So I hope it's not too much of an issue. So I have very standard node going on over here for the volume that you get. And if you're not familiar with the volumetric shading process, please watch the chapter number 2. So it's a very basic setup. I just use the density attribute and just threw in few colors over here and plug that into the colors. And first let's talk about the fire explosion. All right, so we have this, and then in the emission strength I've used in the emission strength we are using the density attribute. Sorry, let me just zoom out a bit. And in the emission color we are using the black body temperature over here. And in the density we have the density attribute, which is multiplied by, I'll just minimize this window so you guys can see much better view. Yeah, there you go. And then there is a Fresnel node which I've used with the multiply over here. This is just to cut out few parts. So overall, when you're not using the Fresnel node, all parts of the smoke are quite like equally dense. So you can use this just to tone down few areas which are creating the silhouettes, just like how the Fresnel node works with the reflections. All right, that is there. And then there are a few multiply nodes just to adjust the values, and I'm pretty sure you guys are aware of this. Yeah, there is no point discussing this. We have already talked about this in the chapter 2. And in the emission strength, we have, let me just mute these nodes and build this one from the scratch. So I'm using the density attribute instead of heat or the flame. That's because if you look at the viewport, so the flames kind of disappears quite fast. I had flames only for around 20 frames, and you can do that actually depending on the what kind of look you are going for. So for this, what I wanted, I thought it looks like a large scale explosion. Maybe I can have the presence of the flames for a much longer duration. So this could look like a gasoline fire. So instead of flames, I'm using density over here, and then I use the power node and another power node to crank up these values, and then post that we have gamma node just to bring in much more sharp highlights over here, and then I multiplied this one with the temperature. So a quite subtle effect. I don't think you will be able to see in the render preview over here. So over here, like, so without this, we have overall emission going on. So I just wanted wherever the temperature is more, so that value to multiply with the density, and that way we have in the later frames. If I go to the frame number 90, so here's the frame number 90, and so if I disable the temperature over here, you can see it kind of looks, I mean, it's not exactly flat, but depending on the presence of the temperature, we can enhance this look. Like some parts could be more darker, some could be more brighter. I think it's quite basic setup. At first glance, it could look like there's a lot going on, but there's nothing much actually. I'll try to build this from scratch. Okay, let's see if I can just give you a quick overview. So bring the density over here, plug that into density converter, and then so we can just use the like first pass of density over here, and then bring the Fresnel to give it some better silhouette, something like this, and then multiply this further. Just play around with values. So I'll leave it as it is, and then another attribute, and this could be heat, flame, or whatever you want. Okay, so depending on the kind of look you're going for, and then there is black body in the emission color, and this heat you can I've used the density, but you can use heat as well. So power node, multiply node, and then color, gamma. So you can develop the look in many ways. So this is another good example. So with the heat attribute, it looks different. All right, and then you can multiply it one more time. So the thing with the heat attribute is if you're going for explosion where on top of everything you want to see the dirt, the dust, and underneath the dust if you want to see the presence of flame, then heat is good because heat is like inside the explosion. But if I use flames, then only where the flames are actually present. At this moment, there are no flames. The flames are only for the earlier frames. Only then I will be able to see, and post that I won't be able to see any flames in the explosion. So that's why I'm not using the flames. If you want to give it some like a really hot burning like a gasoline kind of fire, then go for a density, and that will give it some. Let me just mute this, bring this value up. 5 gamma 50 maybe over here, and in the color we can go for color ramp and maybe add some colors. All right, emission strength, I think emission strength is way too much over here. Yeah, so maybe 2, 1.2. So you get the point, right? I mean then you can multiply this one with the temperature attribute. Everything. I mean another multiply over here and plug this one with that, and then you can just multiply the temperature a bit more. It's going to be add instead of multiply. So there you have it, and obviously I spent much more time on this. That's why this one looks much more refined. Then once you have one good explosion, after that just you can just make any number of explosions. Like I said earlier, just tweak few values in the particle seed or in any of the properties, and it's going to give different results. And I won't say it's cinematic grade explosion at this moment. I think there are a lot of things which can be improved, but I think if I spend some more time on this, I can achieve much better results. And combined with the motion blur and all that, I think in the final render it looks quite decent actually. So this is one of the look, and the other shot where we have the cold winter kind of going on, and there are mountains. So there I used the same explosion but different setup, and in this one I'm not using any emission properties. I just wanted some smoke over here. So just very basic values in the density, and that's about it. Give it some color and some stronger HDR. Like, it's all about creating a right look. I mean, you have the explosion, and after that just play with the speed of the explosion, the look of the explosion, and all that. I'll just open the file and show you the same explosion with the final shader. Alright, so here I have another file. It's the same explosion. It's just that I changed the world, and in this I'm using I think quite a different HDR. This one is from HDR Heaven. Yeah, this HDR I'm using over here, I think. So it has like a cold winter kind of look, and then I played around with the hue saturation and all that. So the scene setup is basically I have this main explosion in the center, and then on this I'm using the same material as you can see over here. Sorry, which one is it? Yeah, there you go. So this is the material. So forget about all that messy things around it, and I'm not even using any attributes over here. So this is just a very basic material. On this one, simple flat shader. That's about it. This is one of the thing, and around this if you see there are few other patches of smoke, and these are basically I'm using these as clouds, what you seen in the trailer. So if I go back to the trailer, yeah, so this sequence over here you can see there are a few secondary smoke domains. I like these look like clouds. So these are basically the explosions which we created earlier. So when we were discussing the particles, so this explosion file, I'll just open this after this example and show it to you. So I'm just using one frame of the VDB. So you can see over here I have multiple duplicates of the same, and this is just one VDB over here. So I just loaded that from the explosion cache. Then we have a ground, and post that there are just a few different camera angles. So we have this one view, and then there is this view. So all that you've seen in the trailer, basically it's a very basic setup. It's just that I changed the ground settings and the lighting and the HDR. All right. So the view is quite dark at this moment. In the post-production I changed the exposure, so I hope you guys can see it over here, and let me just load another view. So that's about it for this sequence and the fire sequence, and these are the renders from both of these sequences. And for the ground explosion, the close-ups, the other sequence, so over there I think let me just load up another file. So here's the ground explosion file, and if I go to the shader editor, you can see it's quite a basic material. Let me just see where's the material. Yeah, this one. So obviously there is no emission shader. That's because it's just the dust that we are using, so we don't need all that. And this is the entire shader. It's very basic one, and I'm sure you can understand this one if you have seen the second chapter of this series. So I'll just enable the render and show you different close-ups that we have taken in the final sequence. So we have standard ground plane with a displacement going on, and then if I zoom into few parts, then you will be able to see what we have been talking about in the second half of the tutorial, all those ripples and all that. I'll jump to the frame number 40. All right, there you go. And in the camera, if I select the close-up cameras, I think we will be able to see already established view over there. Let me just jump to the camera. So scenes kind of get very heavy, guys, and that's what I mentioned in the starting of the tutorial. I hope you are able to enjoy the chapter with all this lag going on. So it's a very heavy data, and I hope you didn't miss out on any part, and it's not too boring to follow along. So here's one of the close-up view, this camera is the right one, and if I go to the video, yeah, so this view, these views, these are over here. All right, and camera number 1, camera number 2. So when you look into the viewport, there isn't much you can see, but when you actually start playing with the render settings and the camera, things turn out differently. All right, and in the environment, I have a pretty standard HDR setup, nothing complicated. I don't think I need this. So this one is actually the default Blender HDR. Yeah, I'm quite lazy when it comes to actually going out and looking for HDRs. So I've been working with the default HDRs for so long, I don't know. So yeah, that's about it for these two scenes. And let me see if there are a few more cameras. So this one over here is the top camera. All right, so just play around with the lower settings, and if you guys struggling with the performance issues, then just play around with the 128 resolution, try to understand the entire thing, how it works, how the initial burst shapes up the mushroom clouds and all that. And later when you start getting confident, only then you start getting into the complex scenes. And I know that these are complex scenes actually. These, like anyone who is working in the VFX industry and all that, like for them these are these are just starter packs. All right, so keeping in mind the limitations of the software and the limited features, I think these are pretty good results. And for animated short films, for like any kind of production, if you are not dealing with like hundreds of explosions, then I think you can just get your job done within the Blender itself. And the results look quite good. In case if I require like some really technically heavy explosion, then obviously I would not prefer at this stage. But in the future, when we have particle nodes, geometry nodes, I think all that coming together will help the Mantaflow simulations, because we will be able to save the presets with the nodes. I hope. I don't know, I'm not coming from the Blender official, I'm just trying to predict things. All right, and the only last thing we haven't discussed at this moment is the very first explosion. So this explosion is actually the most basic one. So if you remember when we started today's tutorial, the very first explosion where we were just starting to discuss the particle setup, so this is the result of that. So I'll just open the file. Alright, so here I have another file, the very first explosion. First, let me just show you the render preview and the material setup. So this one is again a very simple material setup. There is no emission, only the density working over here. And with the Fresnel node, you can see there are less dense parts over here and more dense part over here. So if I disable this, the entire simulation kind of looks really dense. And if you want to just tweak that thing, you can enable and multiply that with the Fresnel. So you will be able to see much lighter parts in some areas and much stronger density in some areas. Yeah, so this is the basic material breakdown. And about the resolution, you would think this is 128, but that's not actually true. If you scroll down over here, I'm using add resolution in the adaptive domain. So how this works is basically, if you have this small domain and then you created explosion, I hope you guys can see this, and explosion gets large and gets out of the box, then you would think, okay, I need to add more resolution. Then you will scale this up. But when you scale this up, that small voxel size gets bigger. So basically you're scaling the entire resolution. Then after this, your explosion will look low resolution. All right, so either now in this case, if this was 128, then you will have to make this one 256. You can either scale this up and increase the resolution, or you can leave that 128 and add more resolution by extending this. And how you extend this is by adding resolution in the adaptive domain. So basically, when your explosion leaves the boundaries, your domain is going to expand and add more resolution with the adaptive feature over here, and that technically is more resolution. So you can safely say that this one is around 330 to 400 resolution. That's the setup for the first one. Now let me just give you a breakdown of particles that are involved in this, and this is exactly the same setup that we started with this tutorial with, when we were just getting to know the particles. So over here I have this one. So I made this one domain where 50,000 particles are shooting up, and just like earlier minutes of this tutorial, and we have initial velocity of 2. So this particle setup basically gave me a nice shape of mushroom over here. It was looking good, but then it was only shooting in the one direction. So what I did was I made a duplicate of these and changed the velocity of these particles. And in this one, I added more velocity towards the y. Over here, you can see minus y, and in this one, it's plus y. So a few particles here and few particles there, and that is what basically helped me expand this explosion. And then I added few secondary particles which are trails just for the initial frames of the simulation, and that's about it. That's the whole setup, guys, and I'll leave this file as well on the gumroad. So I think we are more or less done, and like I said, it is going to be a difficult chapter and quite lazy one. So I hope you guys were able to follow along and you enjoyed this chapter. And like I said, this is going to be kind of the last chapter of this series, just the introduction series. It's not that we won't be talking about Mantaflow in the future. In fact, I may post another video just the next month for this, but just for the introduction series and the commitment which we had made earlier, this is the whole thing. And I think that this was the main subject that I was supposed to discuss a few months ago, but I was not able to actually put my head around this, and I wanted to learn more about this. Alright guys, so we made it through. So this was a very difficult chapter and dealing with so many heavy files, so I was kind of nervous. So I hope things kind of made sense, and it helped you out, and I hope you are in better state to create explosions if you were struggling with this. So those coming from the Mantaflow introduction series, and if you have seen the previous chapters, I think you will be in much better state of following this chapter. And if you have stumbled upon this chapter randomly, please go and watch the previous chapters. It's a very difficult subject, and you might would get lost with the different parameters around, and you might would have hundreds of questions which were already answered in the previous chapters, like shading and the initial setup. All right, so that's about it, and I'll leave these files in the description. The link is in the description. You can get these from Gumroad, and in case if you guys want to play around with the setup, and if you just want to have a look into the files. All right, and also, if I were to give you a quick recap, all that matters is a quick burst of particle. Spend some time in creating the initial burst and get that right, and your explosion is going to look good. All right, if the initial burst is not good, then the explosions are not going to look great. So just spend some time on it. Try to understand the forces and the particles, and yeah, then post that, all that initial velocity, buoyancy, you're already familiar with. That will help you shape up your explosions in different ways. So you can just play around with the different seeds of particles and create hundreds more explosions if you're really enjoying this subject. All right, so I also want to wish my Indian friends a happy Republic Day. I hope you guys are having good time and enjoying your day. If you guys enjoyed this chapter, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share this chapter with your colleagues, your friends on the social media, and let me know your thoughts about this chapter. And if something which I have forgot, you can just mention that in the description. That might would help us out in the future. And if there are any problems which you're facing, you can always leave the comment over here, and I'll try to answer as many as possible, or maybe other people can help out as well. For the future plan, for the February, we have 2 to 3 episodes lined up for the animated content creation series, and that will almost about wrap that series up as well. So I think we are pretty much clearing out the backlogs that we have. Then after that, we are going to announce the next series maybe in the March or April. So stay tuned to check out the other playlist. If you guys are new to this channel, share your results on Instagram, tag me with InstaCrossMind. I would love to see your results. So I'll see you guys around in the next chapters. Stay tuned, take care, goodbye.